volume checked. Is that a little better? No? Okay, there we go. Just let me know now if it's too loud. So there are some seats if you want to fill in. We do have some seats still available, and I know there's some more people coming in. Yeah, raise your hand if you have a seat next to you. There you go. So, hello, good morning. We are so happy to see so many of you here today, devoting a Saturday to hearing about some strategies to oppose authoritarianism. Are we good? Okay. My name is Mike Mayfield, and I'm one of the leaders of the Columbia Gorge Women's Action Network, one of the co-sponsors of today's conference, along with the Skamania County Dems, Skamania Pride, Hood River Latino Network, and the Klickitat County Democrats. Our sponsors have tables surrounding the area here with some other local organizations as well, so please take time during the day to visit them. Recently, I heard a brief story that I found to be meaningful for our work as activists that I wanted to share with you today. And I believe if you're here at this conference, you probably all are activists to some degree or another. So it's a short anecdote that you might be familiar with about A.J. Musty. A.J. Musty was a social activist who during the Vietnam War stood outside the White House, outside the gates, day after day, night after night, actually, in good weather and bad, holding vigil, opposing our country's presence in Vietnam. So a reporter asked him one night, "Mr. Musty, do you really think that you're going to change our country by standing out here alone at night with a candle?" And Musty replied, "Oh, I don't do this to change the country. I do this so the country won't change me." So I think the point to be made is the purpose of activism is twofold. Yes, we hope to make an impact on our local government and beyond that to impact the policies and actions of a government careening towards authoritarianism. But also it is to define who we are personally, to confirm the values that we hold, and to be mindful when the actions of others don't align with those values. It's then that we can speak out with greater conviction and strength. And lastly, I have to share the words of Rob Reiner here, in part because I think his fearless activism is a role model for all of us and deserving of the recognition, but also because his words are especially fitting for our conference today. Rob said, "Silence in the face of authoritarianism is complicity. Speaking out is a patriotic act. Democracy doesn't defend itself. It requires participation, vigilance, and courage from ordinary people."
Yes.
And I'd add, ordinary, courageous people like all of us. So we thank you for your activism. May it continue. And now to introduce today's speakers, please welcome Joe Keir, who is the chair of Skamania County Democrats, and also the person who is largely responsible for all the I lost my train of thought, behind the scenes organization for our conference. So thank you.
So I have a couple of housekeeping notes that I was asked to report to you. We have bathrooms just in the hallway here, and on the west side of the building there's another set of bathrooms. We do have navigators to help you find your workshops, but the workshops are listed in the program, and we will figure out which rooms they're in right before lunch. We do have a donation jar for refreshments over at the coffee stand. And we will have a feedback link at the end of the conference for your feedback available on the Skamania Democrats website. I was going to make an announcement in case people are concerned about any disruptions. We've never had anything like that here. Our hands off, our No Kings protests went off without a problem here in Stevenson. But to allay concerns, how many people here have been trained in de-escalation and safety monitors for the hands-off or No Kings? All right, we have a lot. So these are the folks, if there is someone who wants to cause an incident, these are the folks who will help de-escalate the situation and isolate it. But I think we're in good hands. Thank you. So we are very privileged to have some experts in our subject today. Our first speaker is Janet Campbell. She's been teaching at Mount Hood Community College since 1999, teaching political science. Before that, she taught at the University of Wellington in New Zealand, Glasgow University in Scotland, and the University of Alaska in Anchorage. She worked for Ralph Nader's Public Interest Research Group in Alaska. After that, she did policy research for the state of Washington. And she's worked many jobs, including many blue-collar jobs. Dr. Campbell moved to Stevenson in 2001, which she says is when Walking Man opened as a pub, but wasn't the reason she came. So I know Dr. Campbell has lived even more places, other countries. She's got a wealth of experience in different political systems. She's our expert on authoritarianism. And first to know, someone lost a phone.
Joy?
So,
The name is Joy.
come up to the table and we'll have the phone for you. Okay, let's welcome our expert, Dr. Janet Campbell.
Hi, good morning. I think there should be a handout floating around saying Authoritarianism 101. If you don't have one, share with your neighbor. My talk is going to be just super quick because I just want to define what authoritarianism is according to political science so that we all know what we're kind of talking about today. And then I'll hand it over to my colleagues for further explanation. So basically there's 5 different political systems in the world, and technically in political science, authoritarianism means rule by the military. However, that's not how it's used in popular press. So the characteristics of authoritarianism is taken more from the popular press than it is from political science, because technically it means rule by the military. So if you see at the bottom, places like North Korea, China, Russia, are all labeled authoritarianism, but technically they're kind of different. Like North Korea is a one-party state, cult of the personality. China is a one-party state. Russia is an unhealthy democracy. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. So in terms of technical political systems, we don't need to get into any of that. What we do need to focus on is what are the characteristics of authoritarianism, which is more relevant to what the U.S. is maybe approaching. That's one of the discussion questions we can go into. So, having said that, the characteristics are, it's when power becomes concentrated, either to one individual or a small group of people. It's when the checks and balances don't quite work. So in our situation, Congress is supposed to check presidential powers through the courts, and that's kind of sort of what's happening. But we look at it as meaning a weak rule of law, which means that even if the courts decide against such entities, do those entities actually follow what the courts say? So that's really key to authoritarianism, when the checks and balances aren't working anymore. It means also a lack of what we call political pluralism, which means that there's a lack of free and fair elections, which means intimidation is happening, intimidation of opposition is happening, elections themselves are being futzed with. That's a big sign of authoritarianism. Limited civil liberties. Civil liberties are your rights. It's basically the 10 amendments of the Constitution. So when those rights are being infringed upon, you're not allowed to do it. You have negative repercussions. You have police actions over it, or harassment through social media. That can lead to a chilling of free speech, as we say. And then it means that the press isn't actually functioning properly, so that free press is intimidated one way or another, sometimes blatantly, like jailed, or in the case of Russia, executed journalists, or once again, kind of a suppression of free speech where people are too scared to speak out. So those are characteristics of authoritarianism. It's not an ideology, it's not fascism, it's not a system, it's a movement, I guess you would call it. So saying that at the bottom it says can be soft or hard. So you can have soft authoritarianism, where full and free societies are kind of shrinking, or you can have hardcore authoritarianism, where the military is actually involved in enforcing the centralization of power. So it does have some positives. It's really quick decision making. And a lot of people see this as like, yes, get her done. So that's kind of that's appealing to a lot of people. Everybody feels that authoritarianism is negative, but a chunk of Americans feel it's not so negative because at least they're seeing something being done. And the negatives are I won't even go over the negatives because they're kind of obvious, but it's not, and it also, if you have an authoritarian in there for a long time, you can have long-term planning, which is also kind of a positive about centralization of power of any kind. So the other side of the handout has a look at democracy. So we all know what we love about democracy. We do have a rule of law. We have protection from the government. We have civil rights and liberties, ideally. And we have a separation of powers so that power doesn't become concentrated. Great. But it does have a lot of negatives. It's a really slow, tedious, boring decision-making process. How the world changes is through bureaucrats, and that's not very exciting news. That's not clickbait at all. And there's a kind of inertia to democracy because the change has to be so slow, and a lot of people get very impatient with it. And it's also really crappy at long-term planning because politicians worry about getting elected every 2, 5, 6, 9 years, whatever it is. So they worry about just getting reelected and don't like to make those big, painful long-term changes because they want to be reelected. So it's got a lot of drawback. Also, it's driven by the people. So if you have an unknowledgeable populace that's electing leaders, it can be problematic. You get actors and wrestlers elected. So it's good to look at authoritarianism in the context of the problems with democracy, because I think what we're seeing worldwide is kind of a reaction against that complexity of democracy. So I have listed burning questions, which I'm not going to answer, but we're going to speak, and then we're having a big 1-hour Q&A. So any direction you want to go or any questions you have. My burning questions are, where are we at as America? I would remind people that we have 91,000 governments in America. We are a federalist system. We have state governments, local governments, school boards, county governments, city governments, 91,000 governments. Pretty hard to centralize all of that, just to keep in mind. Pluses and minuses to democracies. How do we solve these? Ideas for other approaches. How are things evolving in our country? Those are my burning questions. So thank you, and thanks for turning out on a Saturday.
So Seth Cotlar is professor of history at Willamette University in Salem. His current research project is entitled Rightlandia, Walter Huss and the Long History of the Far Right in Oregon, 1955 through 2005. Huss was an anti-communist crusader with ties to white nationalists, Christian supremacists, and neo-Nazis who in 1978 was elected chair of the Republican Party in Oregon. Cotlar teaches courses on topics such as the history of the far right, the American Revolution, the history of American conservatism. His first book, was Tom Paine's America, The Rise and Fall of Transatlantic Radicalism in the Early American Republic. And he's also co-editor of Historian-in-Chief, How Presidents Interpret the Past to Shape the Future. He says when he's not writing or teaching, he's rooting for the Timbers or the Thorns, or wasting time doom scrolling on Blue Sky. So, welcome, Dr. Cotlar. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I'm a historian, so I'm going to take a historical approach to this question of authoritarianism. And to my mind, one of the issues that I want to address is the question that frequently comes up is like, this is not who we are, right? How could this be happening in America, right? And because I'm a historian, my answer is America is both an anti-authoritarian country and an authoritarian country. There is no one America, right? Our history contains all of that. And so history isn't going to save us. No one's coming to save us, except for us, right? I just want to start with this definition of fascism, which is one variety of authoritarianism. People argue about whether the F word is useful for describing where we're at today. I'm sort of agnostic on that. I think it is a useful concept, but I also recognize that when you start using that word, a lot of people who need to hear about it just shut off because it's inconceivable to them that America could be a fascist country. So I think authoritarianism is perhaps better because people can sort of hear that. But I think it's very appropriate to describe where we're at using the F word. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to share with you this definition of fascism. This is by historian Robert Paxton, who's largely regarded as pretty much like a reigning expert. You'd be hard-pressed to find a historian who'd be like, oh, that Paxton, he's a hack, right? So this is a very well-respected historian. And I want to also emphasize the year in which he wrote this, which is 2004. When Donald Trump was a New York City playboy who was donating to Democrats, right? So these words were not written about Donald Trump, and they were not written about the contemporary Republican Party, and I'm now going to read them off to you. Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Right, sounds vaguely familiar, right? This description, and again, I'm going to emphasize this paragraph was written in 2004, right? And was not written to describe the George W. Bush administration. That was not his intent. In fact, and Robert Paxton actually, until January 6th, Robert Paxton, journalists would contact him and say like, hey, is America fascist yet? And he was one of the guys saying like, no, that is an inappropriate term to use in reference to America. After January 6th, he's like, yeah, okay, you can start using that word, right? So as a touchstone, I find this definition particularly useful. And again, this is not a partisan definition. This is not out of the ballpark kind of definition. Okay, so part of what I think many of us who are of my vintage and older, and maybe a little bit younger, is that it is really disorienting. The last 10 years have been incredibly disorienting, right? And so I want to honor that sense that people have that like, this is not who we are, because it is really quite different, right? The kind of political experiences that we're having. This is just a very short list, but if you had gone back and told yourself, your 2010 self, let's say, that in 6 years Donald Trump would be president, that would in and of itself be kind of nuts, right? But if you'd said that a president got elected after he called Mexicans rapists when he announced his presidency, you would say, oh, come on, you can't do that. You can't become the president of the United States after saying something racist like that. Or the Access Hollywood tape, right? Like play the Access Hollywood tape for someone and then say, hey, in a month, the American people are going to vote to elect that person president. In 2010, you would have thought, there's no possible way the American public would do that, right? Or the idea that a president would tell thousands of just absolutely shameless, obvious lies that we could all see were lies, right, with our eyes, and that there would be no consequence for that, right, or that large numbers of people just wouldn't care, and the lies about COVID and so on, right? And then January 6th, those of us who lived through it, all of us here lived through it, right? Probably many of us, our experience of that was it was this kind of purgative moment, right? Like, okay, this is the end, right? Even the Republicans acknowledge that this is terrible. This is it, right? Donald Trump is done after this. And it seemed like that for a little bit of time. And then slowly, he came back, right? And the Republican Party just adjusted to it. And now it's just kind of become, oh, well, that's one of those things that just happens, right? And I want to pause on that. January 6th was an outrageous event, an outrageous, unprecedented event. And the fact that the person who was behind it got reelected president is just astounding. We should just not accept that as a normal thing. That is a sign of something really broken and dysfunctional in our political culture, and especially in the Republican Party. If you had gone back to 2010 and told your 2010 self that, like, oh yeah, the federal government would basically stop recommending vaccines and would defund vaccines. Oh, and by the way, we'd come up with like an unbelievably like amazing solution to a global pandemic in a record short period of time, a remarkably effective vaccine, and then half of the country would decide that that was evil and awful and that we would stop investing in that. Again, unthinkable, right? That the American public would accept that. Or that we would embrace climate change denial. If you went back to 2010 and showed the images of these masked agents roaming through American streets and executing white women in their Hondas with a dog in the backseat, having just dropped her son off at school, by standing in front of her and shooting her in the face, right? Like, well, obviously if that happened, the American public would erupt, right, in outrage. Like, how could you possibly do that? And here again, half the country seems to be just metabolizing this as a completely normal thing, right, that happens on America's streets. The attack on Venezuela, right? The same people who talked about how stupid Afghanistan and Iraq was, now are like, oh yeah, Venezuela, that's great. Let's just go like take over that country. That's awesome. So again, if you went back to 2010 and told yourself that we would be talking about invading Greenland and saber rattling at Canada, like what? Why are we doing this? What kind of country is this that would do this? So it is both outrageous and unprecedented, but also part of what I'm gonna argue is that like all of these things have parallels, right, in our history. This is who we are, and it's also who we aren't, right? And so, okay, so I'm gonna go with that. Now, there's a big taboo on using the F word, at least historically there was, in US politics, and sometimes for good reason, right? Rising right-wing authoritarianism around the world poses a significant threat to the future of the world's democracies, but that threat has been hard for many Americans to see, sort of even as it has emerged around us, and I think in part that's because we don't know that much about the history of authoritarianism in the US, and so we think this is something that happens in other places, and not here, and I think that is wrong. This is a very abbreviated history of the American right wing, but since World War II, basically, the US right has been a coalition between the kind of liberal conservatives, this is small l liberal, who accepted religious pluralism, rights-based multiracial democracy, and the rule of law. So this is perhaps like Bill Buckley, right? Everybody, those of us of a certain age, right? William F. Buckley, or Mark Hatfield from Oregon, or whatever. There's a long history of these Republicans who completely accepted that general post-World War II consensus that America was a religiously pluralistic, multiracial democracy, right? That valued the rule of law. Full stop. That's just who we are, right? That is the consensus that the Trump administration is basically trying to blow up, right? And explode right now. But here's the thing, is that coalition included people like Hatfield and Packwood, et cetera, but also right-wing authoritarians of a variety of stripes. These were Christian nationalists, these were white nationalists, these were conspiracy-obsessed anti-communists, right? And all these people rejected those values. So the guy I'm writing about was in Group B, and he became the chair of the Oregon Republican Party in 1978, right? So this stuff has been percolating inside the Republican Party for a very long time, right? It just hadn't, it was getting a foothold, but wasn't the dominant threat. Okay. And you've probably seen the stories about the young Republican chat groups, about how much they love Hitler, and the rise of Nick Fuentes as a significant figure in our political culture, which is outrageous. The guy's a Hitler-loving neo-Nazi, and somehow he's a major power broker now in the Republican Party. This is, again, a sign of a major dysfunction in our political culture, and especially on the American right. Okay. So one of the obstacles, another obstacle, and this is an obstacle that comes from the left, is kind of minimizing who American authoritarians are. Yeah, so this, you've probably seen this Mad Magazine thing. It's made the rounds on social media and so on. And so these sorts of people are people who we laugh at and think are either uniquely evil or uniquely stupid. And many of them are evil and stupid, right? But I think what that does is it doesn't take seriously the threat that these folks pose. If any of you saw the Quentin Tarantino film, I'm blanking on the name now, it was about the South and the Klan. Django Unchained. And there's a scene in there where the Klan is riding and they're kind of buffoons, right? They can't get their things on right. And so the audience, the presumably white audience, is supposed to laugh at how dumb and stupid these Klansmen are. There's a long history of Americans laughing at Klansmen. If you're black in the South, the Klan is not something you laugh about, because the Klan was deathly serious. If you were Jewish in the North, you did not laugh at the Klan because they were deathly serious and murderous. If you were Latino in Colorado, you did not laugh at the Klan because they were deathly serious. If you were Catholic in Indiana, you may not know this. The reason why the Notre Dame is called the Fighting Irish, I don't know if you all know, in 1924, the Klan came to attack Notre Dame, and a group of Notre Dame students beat the crap out of the Klansmen, right? And drove them off the campus, and that's how they got the name the Fighting Irish. Okay. Anyway, the Notre Dame College Republicans, by the way, are now Hitler posting on Twitter, so much for that history. Okay, but anyway, so this idea that the folks on the right are just like kind of silly, laughable super patriots is, I think, an obstacle to taking seriously the depth and extent of this right-wing threat. Okay, so I want to end by talking about the resources we have in our history for naming and resisting kind of rising authoritarianism. So you can all find this. This is on the interwebs at archive.org, which is a great website. This is an Army orientation fact sheet from 1945. I believe it's March of 1945, so near the end of the war. And this was aimed at officers who would use this material for training sessions with their soldiers. And the point of it was, we just fought this war against fascism, right, in Europe. And it could happen in the United States, right? The materials for it are there in the United States, as we knew from the 1930s and what was happening, right? The rising fascism around the US in the 1930s and 40s. And so the idea was, we just spent all this blood and treasure. We need to be sure that this doesn't reemerge in the United States. And the presumption was that it could, right? Okay, and so what they did is they talked about the challenges of doing it. And one of the challenges that they found was that if you want to fight fascism, it never calls itself that, right? Fascism is different from something like, say, socialists. There are the Democratic Socialists of America, and they use that name, and they say, this is who we are, this is what we believe. Fascists, especially in America, almost never use that term to describe themselves. But that doesn't mean they're not fascists, right? Just because they don't use that word to describe themselves. Usually in the United States, fascism, and this is one of the defining features of fascism, is that it takes a different form in every country where it emerges, that it adjusts itself to the culture of every particular country. And so in the United States, it will define itself as Americanism, as Christian patriot, right? So the Christian patriot movement was the militia movement, basically, from the 1980s and 90s. And on the face of it, like, well, what's wrong with being a Christian? What's wrong with being a patriot? And obviously the answer is nothing. There's nothing wrong with being a Christian. There's nothing wrong with being a patriot. But Christian patriot was the branding that they used to build their domestic terrorist far-right organization that people like Timothy McVeigh were a part of. He called himself a Christian patriot. And he intentionally did that in order to hide behind those values, right, that are in and of themselves not fascist or not exceptionable, right? But in the form that Timothy McVeigh acted them out, they were. In this, and these are all just screenshots from this guide. So they had 3 suggestions as to how to spot a fascist activist. 1, they will instigate hate campaigns against minority races, religions, and other groups. Right? That's the first thing that they will do. They will try to pit people against each other by telling lies. Usually this was about Jews in the 1940s, but not alone. Right? Also, they will tell lies about Black Americans, etc. Okay. Second, they will espouse an exclusive ultranationalism that rejects empathy for and cooperation with others. Right? So this idea of the brotherhood of man, which implies that all people, regardless of color, race, creed, or nationality, have rights, that is what they will focus on. They will say that is weakness. The idea that we should cooperate with other countries, that we should have respect for people who are different from us, they will target that specific bundle of values and will say that that is evil, right? And that is the problem. You may have heard Elon Musk going off on his rants about how terrible empathy is and how it's going to spell the death of Western civilization, supposedly, right? And so this is all just aimed at religious traditions and ethical traditions that center and emphasize the importance of empathy, caring, respect, etc. So that's the second thing. And again, this is 1945, right? This is not me saying this. This is the US Army, that notoriously communist organization, saying this in 1945. Okay? Third, they will label everyone to their left a communist and say the government should take action to destroy the left. Right? So the use of communist as a scare term, and you've probably heard this, our current president says this all the time. Elon Musk described Kamala Harris as a communist. Democrats are frequently referred to as communists, right? And it's kind of laughable, right? It's so silly. Like, it just, whatever, the Cold War ended in 1991. I mean, like it's been a long time. But anyway, it still has power, this scare term. And this idea that you lump a whole group of people into this category of the left, communists, and frame them not as people who you disagree with, who are your fellow Americans, but frame them as your enemy, right? As an existential threat and enemy to the country. Okay. Fascists will argue that we have to do authoritarian things. Hey, I still believe in freedom, but I mean, come on now, look at these domestic terrorists, right? And what they're doing, we have to get tough with that. And they will frame it as a necessary response to the communist left. So they will justify things that they would be appalled by if it happened to them, right? But if it's happening to someone else, then it's okay. So this kind of I got an email from President Trump telling me that I was a member of his anti-communist club, so I'm good. I'm not worried about this. In case anything ever happens, I can just trot out this email and let people know I'm good. I'm part of the anti-communist club. Okay. This is the CEO of the Federalist, which you may know about, which is a right-wing kind of outlet. So just the other day, he issued this tweet saying that FDR's 4 freedoms are communism. Right? FDR's 4 freedoms, communism. Like Norman Rockefeller did a whole series of paintings, famous paintings about this. The idea that Norman Rockefeller, Norman Rockwell and FDR are communists is at some level laughable, but also very much part of that kind of fascist tradition. Okay, I just want to end with these 2 important figures who are worth kind of learning more about. Carl Schmitt was known as the kind of philosopher of the Nazi regime, and his central idea was the idea that all of politics is organized around the friend-enemy distinction. Right? And Carl Schmitt has become very popular amongst the intellectuals on the American right today. who have basically embraced his vision of how politics works, right? So that when you are talking about your political opponent, you refer to them as your enemy, right? And an enemy not just to you, but an enemy to the entire state and nation. And once you've framed your opponent as the enemy to the state, that then justifies the use of state power in all sorts of authoritarian ways. So that's part of what's happening. And it's not just me saying that these people sound like Carl Schmitt. These are major thinkers on the right at the Claremont Institute with ties to the Trump administration saying that they think Carl Schmitt is pretty cool and got it right. And then the second is Ernst Frankl, who is not a Nazi, but was a jurist during the Nazi era. And he had developed this analysis of the dual state, which is the idea that the rule of law still exists, right? Courts are still functioning, but there's also a kind of dual state where it appears as if the person who assassinated Renee Good on camera that we all saw will likely not face legal consequences for that act of murder. I hope there is a legal process. I'm very doubtful that it will happen, right? And so the idea that there's a kind of law for some people have said that it's like the idea that that there's one group of people who the law binds but does not protect, and then there are a group of people who the law protects but does not bind, right? And that distinction has become a very central part of the politics of our contemporary era, and that is truly frightening. Okay, so I will stop there and hand it over to our last speaker.
Donna. She arrives with a boom. Donna Sinclair is a history professor, author, oral historian, and public history professional. She's former Washougal Planning Commissioner, Washougal School Board member, and she's vice chair of Clark County Democrats. And she has also been a leader of Indivisible Greater Vancouver since 2017. She teaches U.S. and Pacific Northwest history, public policy, Native American, and sustainability courses at WSU Vancouver and Western Oregon University. Her research focuses on diversifying the U.S. Forest Service in the Civil Rights era. She's co-author of Black Women in Green, Gloria Brown and the Unmarked Trail to Forest Service Leadership. So I want to tell you that I've known Donna for a long time, and she has a lot more credentials than this. She's been very active for a long time, and I'm really pleased to introduce, and I would thank your warm welcome for Dr. Donna Sinclair.
Thank you, Joe. I don't have to stand up there. That was pretty impressive, Seth. Well, thanks to everyone who's here today. It's really great to see so many people who care about this topic enough to turn out on a Saturday for almost an entire day. Make sure that what I have here is going to work. I'm going to go over here. Okay, so the way that I want to talk about this is a little bit different. I'm going to take a long trajectory of U.S. history to talk about it, and I want to situate the conversation in a more complicated, not a more complicated look, because these two are very complicated, right? A complicated history of democratic expansion in the United States and retraction that allows for authoritarianism. So at the founding, only property-holding men could vote, and I'm sure you've all heard that before. That included actually a very few African American men, depending on where they lived. And their voting rights were removed by the 1830s. It also included immigrants. So their voting rights would be removed little by little and state by state. But over time, participation in democracy expanded, almost never peacefully. And I think that's really important for us to understand. Resistance was actually key to the expansion of democracy. So violence sometimes ensued when non-property holding white men demanded the vote in the early 19th century. Everybody learned about universal suffrage, right, when you were in school? Guess what? It wasn't universal. Women didn't have it, people of color didn't have it, Native people didn't have it, and that pattern repeats. So black male suffrage during Reconstruction was met with organized violence and legal suppression. Woman suffrage required sustained protest, hunger strikes, and legal demands. And actually, they got beat up sometimes. Native American voting rights were unevenly recognized and often obstructed right into past the mid-20th century. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed decades of intimidation and exclusion. So the point is not that American democracy expanded smoothly, but that it took struggle for the expansion. And just as importantly, it has been repeatedly narrowed without a single coup, despite January 6th, or any sort of declaration. As Seth said, they don't label it authoritarianism or fascism. So that authoritarian power grows very quietly in the United States through things like restricting participation and reinforcing exclusion, redefining belonging, eroding norms, and normalizing extraordinary measures. All of these things we've been experiencing. So today I want to ask what history shows about the kinds of opposition that has mattered most when democracy was under strain. Because we're here to talk about some strategies too, right? Not just the evil of fascism, which is important to understand. So why did protest, institutions, the rule of law, and civic memory matter? Why do these things matter? So these are a series of questions that I have about how we can get this started. But the really framing premise here is that American democracy expands through struggle. It's been periodically narrowed through law, violence, and norm erosion, and that it's important to understand both dynamics in order to resist the authoritarian drift. So we've seen authoritarianism in the United States emerge recently and over time through the expansion of executive power through executive orders, suppression of dissent, or chilling of dissent, the erosion of voting rights and democratic participation, racialized or ideological definitions of who belongs, normalization of extraordinary measures as temporary or necessary, and in every case, authoritarian drift was challenged not by courts alone, but by organized resistance, institutional courage, public narrative, the stories matter, and long-term civic memory. So from the start, American democracy rested on two linked ideas: freedom of religion through disestablishment and legitimacy through the rule of law, rather than personal authority. And those principles were tested almost immediately. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 criminalized dissent in the name of security. Courts did not stop them. And what mattered was public resistance, a free press, and the peaceful transfer of power, which came just after this in the election of 1800, and that reaffirmed that no leader stands above the law. That was really significant. We don't hear about it enough. Now, Andrew Jackson and his expansion of executive supremacy. Andrew Jackson's a really important guy. Not only is he Trump's favorite president, but he really provides an early example of authoritarian drift without a coup. He claimed that winning elections gave him the authority to override institutional limits. He centralized executive power. He ignored Supreme Court rulings. And he framed opposition as elites standing in the way of people. It's almost like Trump's been studying Jackson, isn't it? And resistance did not come from the courts alone. It came from Congress asserting its authority, from newspapers openly mocking Jackson as King Andrew, which is, I think that image is sort of reflective of what King Andrew looked like, and from the formation of an opposition party, the Whigs, specifically to check executive overreach. So the lesson here is not that elections prevent authoritarianism, it's that elections without institutional limits can accelerate it. And again, we've been seeing this. So there he is, the image of King Andrew. So democratic expansion was actually real in the 19th century, but it was selective. This is the time period. Actually, Andrew Jackson's time period is also known as the age of the common man, because that's when universal suffrage came about. But it was selective. So those property requirements fell for white men, while women, Black Americans, and Native people remained excluded, and expansion wasn't smooth or peaceful. It was contested through violence, law, and repression. So the Dorr War in Rhode Island shows this clearly. Working class white men mobilized for suffrage, and elites resisted, and federal power intervened. So they sent the troops into Rhode Island. Even as the franchise widened, its boundaries were actively policed. Even as democracy expanded for white men, again, including immigrants, up through the end of the 19th century in many cases, and even into the 20th century, it remained violently contested and uneven. Now, Reconstruction, which comes next, not next in time, but next in my slides, tested whether the nation was willing to extend democratic power beyond that narrow boundary. And it did for just a little while, until white supremacy, law, and violence overruled it. There we go. So, after Reconstruction, democracy did not simply fall. It was dismantled. And I know in the last 5 years, a lot of people have learned more about this, but I suspect when most of us grew up, that the way that Reconstruction was taught was as a terrible period in American history. The truth is, it was actually a pretty brilliant period of potential. So, white supremacist regimes during this time used violence, voter suppression, and new legal frameworks like the Black Codes to preserve the appearance of elections while stripping them of substance. Now, resistance didn't disappear during Reconstruction. It changed form, and so it moved into Black-led institutions like the churches and schools and mutual aid societies, and into long, long legal struggles that would not succeed for decades. Now, this was authoritarianism embedded in law and custom and not imposed by decree. So, again, it's most typically hidden. Reconstruction also established the constitutional foundations for later democratic expansion, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, even as white supremacy worked to nullify them in practice. So still, the amendments remained on the books, and they would be renewed in the 1950s and 1960s. And I always tell my students that the 14th Amendment is my favorite amendment because it actually incorporates due process, birthright citizenship, and equal protection under the law. So if we had to have one amendment for the 20th and 21st century, I would pick that one. So let's see. Now, during World War II, the federal government incarcerated more than 120,000 Japanese Americans. I want to reiterate, Japanese Americans. A lot of times, again, my students will say, they'll write the Japanese. No, Japanese Americans. These are people born in the United States, citizens, and they did it without due process. So that was a suspension of democracy, and it was justified by fear, and it was framed as military necessity. Now, resistance existed even then. Individuals like Gordon Hirabayashi, he's here in the book, A Principled Stand, which is one of my favorite books, actually. Fred Korematsu and Minoru Yasui, who is from Hood River, so there were Oregon actually protested, so good for you. So Hirabayashi challenged curfew, they all challenged incarceration, and they went to court, knowing they would likely lose. And they did at the time. But the story doesn't end there. Decades later, evidence showed the government had lied to the Supreme Court. A report surfaced, and those convictions were vacated, and the United States formally acknowledged the injustice. That's when you started, those of you who were around then, started to hear about Japanese American incarceration. Now, this matters because it shows that resistance can fail in the moment and still shape democratic accountability over time. In the early Cold War, fear again became a governing tool. So loyalty programs, congressional investigations, and blacklists punished beliefs rather than crimes. Dissent was treated as disloyalty. And what ultimately weakened McCarthyism was not a single court ruling, but exposure. Some of you may remember the See It Now program, and others hopefully have heard of it, or maybe you haven't. There were televised hearings, investigative journalism, and public visibility that revealed the abuse of power. And when Americans could see it, fear lost its grip. So that's another recurring pattern. Transparency and narrative can collapse authoritarian authority. So the civil rights movement would take those same tools, visibility, coalition, moral clarity, and the force of law itself to change. So here is the March on Washington, and what we see is mass mobilization. It's interracial, and that's important. Jobs and freedom, it's the March for Jobs and Freedom, right? So economics matter, and moral pressure is made visible. I always have, again, I'm just gonna come back to my students because I talk to them a lot about these things. I have them look at this image and ask them, what does this look like? What do you actually see here, right? Physically. What you see is a group primarily of African American women, but also white women. There's some there in the picture. They're very well dressed. These are not radical leftists, right? And I would add that there has been an attempt to label Black freedom and Black freedom movement since the very beginning as communism. Heather Cox Richardson writes about that. So this visibility made inequality impossible to ignore. And it linked civil rights and economic justice, and it demonstrated the power of mass interracial nonviolent mobilization. Now, protest did not replace law. It created the conditions for law to act. And this is really important because it is, there are multiple overlapping movements and phenomena that create the possibility of laws that change the society that we live in. So the United Farm Workers showed multi-layered resistance in action. And they demonstrated how resistance becomes durable, how it becomes long-lasting. This was not spontaneous, it was built over time. And their movement created a moral appeal and an institution that could outlast a single march. So this multi-layered resistance in action included collective action with strikes and boycotts and marches and mass participation, the law. There were strategic lawsuits. This is true of the African American civil rights movement also, that benefited all of us. Labor contracts and enforcement of worker protections. Institutions built durable unions rather than a single protest moment. And the culture and narrative is also really important. So songs, symbols, things like fasting, hunger strikes, women did that to get the vote also, and storytelling to humanize these workers, as well as coalitions, farm workers, churches, students, consumers, and urban allies. So remember the Grape Boycott, remember tomato boycotts, all of these things. We hear a lot about boycotts. They don't always work, but sometimes they do. So the lesson here is that change came not from one tactic, but from the sustained pressure across law, culture, institutions, and public conscience. So, this is Mississippi Freedom Summer. Hopefully you've heard about this. But it really shows how democracy expands only when people are willing to risk violence. I hate to say that, but obviously it's true, more and more obvious these days. They had voter registration, education, and organizing that made the exclusion that existed visible. A lot of people outside of the South didn't really believe that there was a problem. And so that's also important. The visibility is really significant. And so the violence that was used to stop freedom really illustrated the moral bankruptcy of the entire system. So authoritarian systems collapse when popular movements compete with institutional alignment with constitutional ideals. So constitutional ideals matter, espousing them matters. People care about the Constitution. Sometimes it feels like they only care about the Second Amendment, but the fact of the matter is we have an entire Constitution, so I'm prone to reminding people of that pretty often. So, Civil Rights Act. It did not appear on its own. It followed years of organizing, exposure, and sacrifice. And that's the pattern that we see again and again. Protest creates legitimacy and it draws attention and the law follows. That has been part of the history of the United States. There has been a democratic expansion, access to democracy for different groups of people over time. So I guess I'm trying to put a little bit of a positive spin on this because we didn't start out with access to democracy for everybody. In fact, it was very limited, very elite. But over time, the Constitution has allowed us to demand our rights, which includes access to democracy. So here again, revolutionary times, public memories. These things are really important, and I'm not going to try and do a history lesson here. We can talk more about some of these things if you'd like. I do want to point out that I have an image here of the Winter Soldiers. From 1970 in Detroit, the Winter Soldiers came together and on a radio broadcast and also some film, which was not actually aired until more recently, they talked about what was happening in Vietnam. They talked about the My Lai massacre. They talked about society. Watch the movie Winter Soldiers. It's really worth it. So we see the visibility and testimony that made state violence undeniable, and stories becoming a form of resistance. So again, I say stories matter a lot. Public memory is key. And that is, I think, why the story around Renee Good is being twisted, because it could very well be a really serious flashpoint. So I think it's important for all of us to push back against the story that we're hearing, to use the moral clarity that we have about what happened to her and the overreach of a police state at this point in time that does not actually have the authority to do anything that it did, not just killing her, but even telling her what to do. She's an American citizen with rights, and we have a Constitution. And the fight for the Equal Rights Amendments, just one illustration. It was really hard. I actually cut a whole bunch of things I was going to say because I only had 20 minutes. And so I chose this because this shows that even peaceful, constitutional, democratic claims that are supported by the majority of the country can trigger backlash. So you have the Stop the ERA movement, which with Phyllis Schlafly, I don't have a picture of her here, although I have them in other PowerPoints. But when they threaten existing power, there's always backlash. And so I would argue that this is another pivotal reason for the MAGA backlash. We have the women's movement, we have the LGBTQ movement that builds on the women's movement as well. We have trans rights. All of these things are extensions of democracy that come from those early movements. And there are groups of people who don't want everyone to be included, which is authoritarianism. Okay, so this is just a summary with some core patterns for anti-authoritarian strategy. So we know that law constrains power. Protests shift possibility and they make authoritarianism visible, and culture sustains the meaning. So that's where it's up to all of us. Institutions endure only if people occupy them and support them. And resistance is multi-layered. I don't think I can say that enough, because a lot of us feel like either we're not doing enough, there's no point in doing the work of resistance, but it's multi-layered. Every little bit matters. And the truth is, historically, we don't know how it will turn out. We only know what we can do. So grassroots organizing, the media and the stories, the legal challenges, electoral action and institutional change all matter. And of course, you already heard this once, but let's say it again. Silence is not neutral. And let's make sure that we tell our, people that we know who we can say it in a kind and loving way, or maybe not, but I try to. In every case, normalization and silence enabled authoritarian expansion. And public articulation of values matters. Who are we? Who have we been since World War II? We know the world that we thought it was, and behind the scenes, as Seth Cotlar pointed out, there was a whole other world burbling and bubbling, and it was, so for some of us it was kind of a shock, maybe not for others. Short-term losses do not negate resistance. So Japanese incarceration and reconstruction show that failure in the moment does not mean failure in history. We can keep pushing. We can push from the past. Democracy requires maintenance. This one's really important. We can't just get disgusted with democracy because it's slow and because other people who we don't agree with have a voice, right? Deliberation is important. That's what democracy is about. And authoritarianism exploits complacency. Resistance requires sustained civic engagement. So some of the things that I think are important for us to take away today is that we need to build durable coalitions, not just moments of protest. I'm just gonna say, all of the argument within the left is not very, I mean, people can do different things, that's totally fine, but we should all recognize we're on the same side. Obviously you are, or you wouldn't be here. Defend institutions. Invest in narrative and memory. Get those stories out there. I think that's really important. And then treat democracy as an active practice, not a settled condition. I think the treating it as a settled condition might be where we went wrong. And then finally, engage in electoral politics at every level. That fact about 91,000 governments, that's so important because the Republicans have recognized this. They have been placing people in positions at lower levels of government for decades. And we've only begun, and I'm not talking about partisan politics. Those of us who believe in freedom and equality have only recently begun to see how important it is to actually get in at the ground level. So I hope you'll get involved, and I want to thank Skamania County Democrats for doing this conference. It's amazing to see you here, so thank you.
Okay, now we're going to have a question and answer roundtable. So you can offer questions and we'll allow all three speakers to offer their comments and maybe have some discourse among themselves. So I'll bring the mic down. We have someone right here.